Okay. Good evening to one and all present here. On behalf of Dharwad Katte Dharwad, I extend a warm and heartfelt welcome to our distinguished resource person, respected chairperson, and all the viewers joining us for the third program of the English lecture series. We are truly delighted to have all of you with us this evening. Today's session focuses on the thought-provoking theme A.K. Ramanujan, the poet and the folklorist. It's now my privilege to introduce our esteemed resource person, Professor Nandini Sahu. Professor Nandini Sahu is an acclaimed Indian English poet, novelist, literary critic. She serves as the Vice Chancellor of Hindi University, West Bengal, and is a professor of English at Indira Gandhi National Open University. She has received multiple gold medals for her academic excellence. Her research interests include Indian English literature, folklore and culture studies, Indian knowledge system, and Hindu studies. She has authored and edited more than 20 books, including acclaimed poetry collections such as The Other Voice, The Silence, Silver Poems on My Lips, and Sita, a poem. Her works have been widely published in India and abroad. We are honored to have you with us today, madam. And I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge and welcome our respected chair for today's program, Professor Vasubraj P. Donur, sir, Head Department of English, Central University of Karnataka. And he is one of the well-known academicians in Karnataka whose academic vision, encouragement, and constant support have inspired many scholars and literary initiatives. He is a great translator as well. And he's the driving force behind the success of Dharwad Katte and the Department of English, Central University of Karnataka. And before we proceed further, I would like to inform the audience that today's lecture will be delivered for approximately 50 minutes. This will be followed by the presidential remarks by our respected chair, and thereafter we shall open the floor for discussion and interaction. Now, without taking much time, I humbly invite our esteemed resource person, Professor Nandini Sahu, madam, to deliver a talk on A.K. Ramanujan, the poet and the folklorist. Madam, the session is all yours.
Thank you so much. May I?
Please, ma'am.
Yeah, sure. So I'm grateful to Professor Vasubraj and Professor Nirmal and Dharwad Katte, the Literary and the Cultural Forum, for having given me this opportunity to share my research on A.K. Ramanujan, one of uh, the remarkable scholars and poets and folklorists that India has, or maybe the world has ever seen, and one of my personal favorite writers, because in the year 1996, 95, 96, when I completed my master's degree and then I wrote the junior research fellowship examination, and then I didn't know much about a lot of Indian writers, Indian poets, because in our syllabus we had very few Indian writers. That was the period when most of the universities had only British literature, American literature, bit of Canadian studies, Australian literature, one or two chapters, and at best Indian writing in English, where they had Denizam Ezekiel and maybe Jayant Mahapatra, and because I was a student in Orissa, so bit of Jayant Mahapatra, and women's writing, bit of Kamala Das, so things like that. It was very, very confined. And my exposure to A.K. Ramanujan was not through any of my poems or courses prescribed in the MA English syllabus, but for my preparation for junior research fellowship, I read a bit of, not a lot of A.K. Ramanujan and his poetry. I hadn't read about Ramanujan as a folklorist at that point of time, but I was reading A.K. Ramanujan as a poet. Then I met my prospective supervisor, late Professor Niranjan Mohanty, who shifted to Santiniketan, so I had to be shifted along with him. So I asked him who should be the poets on whom writing a thesis would be kind of thought-provoking for me, and he prescribed so many poets. A.K. Ramanujan, R. Parthasarathi, G.S. Sarachandra, and then Jayant Mahapatra, Kamala Das. He recommended so many poets, and our generation, people born in the 70s and 80s, our generation used to read only these poets. And then I asked him why A.K. Ramanujan. And then he prescribed a couple of books to go through. And the poetry of A.K. Ramanujan was so impactful for me. I was so influenced by the poetry of A.K. Ramanujan. And at that time, even I had started writing poetry. Dr. Nirmal has already introduced my 25 books, out of which 10 are poetry collections. And my first poetry collection was almost ready at that time, though I was a student of MA English. My first poetry collection was kind of ready at that time. And I used to read A.K. Ramanujan, and I used to try to follow the style of writing, the fluidity of the language, the fluency, the thought. And there were so many poems that influenced me. I will go to those one by one. And then I completed my PhD. Then my poetry collections kept on coming one after the other. And in the year 2005, I went to Indira Gandhi National Open University, the world's largest university in terms of students intake. And I designed the MA program in folklore and culture studies there, MAFCS. If you Google MAFCS from IGNO and Nandini Sahu, you will find the detailed syllabus of folk literature. And in MFC 008, where we have talked about folk representations, the 20,000 pages of study material, open access, open for you to download and read. There is one chapter on A.K. Ramanujan, the folklorist. So when we discussed that chapter in the experts committee meeting, I was also kind of overwhelmed by the kind of work A.K. Ramanujan has given on folk literature. So it got me to thinking a poet, and then in due course of time becoming a folklorist. So the two identities, did the poet influence the folklorist, or did the folklorist influence the poet? It's like the chicken or the egg, who comes first? I was also confused for quite some time. Who created who, the poet and the folklorist? But ultimately, I came to a conclusion that when a brain is as empathetic, as compassionate, and as critical and complex and poetic, like A.K. Ramanujan, then the creation of a folk mind, you all must have, or maybe you might have heard that the idea of a creation of a folk mind. So A.K. Ramanujan had a folk mind. Now, what is a folk mind? A person who has a mind of empathy, sympathy, inclusivity, uh, flexibility, and then a mind who is culturally, emotionally, personally rooted. Though A.K. Ramanujan spent a major portion of his life out of India, but he had never been out of love with India, the ethnographic essentialism of India. He had never been out of those things. So simultaneously, he was working on the plurality of Indian folkloristic, and he was also writing lots of poetry. I will make a very humble attempt to speak something important that I feel important about the language, memory culture, the performance, the history, gender, caste, the regional consciousness. I won't say regional, the Bhasha consciousness of A.K. Ramanujan in his poetry as well as his folklore research. And I will try to put it across to all of you today. And once again, Dr. Nirmal, thank you for giving me this topic. When Dr. Nirmal invited me to speak, I asked him what are the topics. Then he sent me a list of topics which were very interesting. All of them were interesting. Then I sent him a message back that I want to speak on all of them. Then he must be smiling. Then he said, ma'am, you please choose your best. Then I said, well, let me speak on A.K. Ramanujan, because I think this is my service to A.K. Ramanujan. And in my hundreds and hundreds of lectures that I have delivered all over the world, I have never spoken about A.K. Ramanujan, though I have done a lot of research on him. I have published research papers on him. I have done courses on him in my MA program in Folklore and Culture Studies. K Ramanujan is a major chapter. I've written a lot about him, but today I'm going to speak about him, and that gives me some kind of peace and happiness. I wish A.K. Ramanujan was there to listen to me, but to my misfortune, he's not there. Coming to my subject, among the 20th century Indian intellectuals, A.K. Ramanujan, I try to spell the name Attipat Krishnaswamy Ramanujan. I'm not sure if Attipat or how to say that. He occupies a singular position as a poet and a translator, a linguist, a folklorist, an anthropologist, and a comparatist. This is so many things, even there can be more. And his scholarships transferred into folklore from an antiquarian archive into a dynamic epistemological field. He had wide exposure. He lived out of India. He came across so many eminent scholars from Western philosophy and thinking. I will try to quote some of them. His contribution lies not only in collecting oral traditions, collecting oral traditions and memory cultures is a major thing that the folklorists do. But this is not his only contribution, but rather in theorizing the folklore as a complex semiotic system where language, memory, performance, history, gender, caste, and regional identities or bhasha identities, they continuously negotiate some kind of meaning. Ramanujan charged colonial ethnographic essentialism. The Britishers, if you look at the various periods of folklore in Indian universities, then the British period is very powerful. The Britishers were, fortunately or unfortunately, the first group who actually collected folklore and they created archives for their benefit. We know what was their benefit, but A.K. Ramanujan, he challenged that colonial ethnographic essentialism, because when they collected Indian folklore, they did it from a perspective, from the colonialist perspective, not from the perspective of the marginal, the caste hierarchy, the tribal hierarchy. So they never looked at those things. They had some sort of an ethnographic essentialism, and then then the nationalistic homogenization by talking about the plurality, the instability, and the contextuality of Indian traditions. A.K. Ramanujan was the first person to do that, if I may. His folklorist methodology anticipates many concerns of post-structuralism, performance theory, cultural studies, new historicism, and post colonial thought long before these frameworks became dominant in Indian academia. In Indian academia, folklore came very, very late. Even today, you won't find many universities in India who teach folk literature. Folklore, we musicize folklore at a distance. We keep it at a distance. We glorify folklore. We romanticize folklore. We musicize folklore. But very few universities have the conviction actually to bring folklore from that romantic tradition and from only that oral and the oral tradition and then put it in the university table in the written form. A.K. Ramanujan started it at a time when no one was actually willing or no one had the exposure to do this kind of a thing. His poetic voice, but first let me talk about A.K. Ramanujan as a poet, then slowly I'll go to the folklorist. His poetic voice remains essentially modern. It occupies a prominent place in the new Indian poetry in English. By virtue of his intellectual stamina, his powerful language, his ability to articulate the inner struggle of human beings, Ramanujan's poetry shows a kind of sophistication. Though he wrote in English, the metaphoric interiority of Tamil language and Tamil classical literature has given a rare identity to Ramanujan as a poet. And this is one of the ways by which both A.K. Ramanujan and R. Parthasarathy could overcome the problems of alienation and identity, because they were very rooted. Ramanujan lived and died as an expatriate in the USA, yet the memory of his Tamil past has shaped his poetry, which has ultimately led to his folklore research as well. and then born and brought up in Mysore. He spent the later half of his life as a professor of linguistics and Dravidian studies in the University of Chicago. His first poems appeared in the Illustrated Weekly of India under the editorship C.R. Mandy, but it is interesting to note that it was his unimportant poems that saw the light of the day in the weekly. His first collection came in 1966, The Striders. It won him the Poetry Book Society recommendation. It was followed by his next collection, Relations, in 1971, and both the volumes were published by Oxford University Press in England, not in India. His other works include 15 Tamil poems, 1965, The Interior Landscape, 1967, Speaking of Shiva, 1979, Selected Poems, and then the second site, The Collected Poems, published from OUP Delhi. Slowly he came to OUP Delhi. A considerable scholar in three languages, English, Kannada, and Tamil, he has produced poetry in Kannada and English, living in an entirely alien literary culture and ethos. His important Kannada poetry volumes are Hoppulalli Hubli, I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly, and 1969, and then Kuntuvel, I'm sure the pronunciation is wrong. He felt intensely about the cultural roots when he began to live in an alien land. I did not use the word alien, but somehow I'm quoting some critics who say that his expatriate experience was kind of an experience of alien for him, which is debatable. I will come to that. Okay, this seems to have pushed him back to a Hindu ethos in his poetry. He has a challenging individual situation to grapple with, and his English poetry reflects the agonizing experience of an expatriate. His poetry harped on the dualism of cultural consciousness. His poetry is mostly concerned with nostalgia and memory, family relationships, self search as a Hindu, and search of love. His Indianness comes through in one way or another. About his poetry, he has said, let me quote him: English and my disciplines, linguistics and anthropology, give me my outer forms, linguistic, metrical, logical, and other such ways of shaping experience. In my first 30 years in India, my frequent visits and field trips, my personal and professional preoccupations with Kannada, Tamil, the classical and folklore give me my substance, my inner forms, images, and symbols. They are continuous with each other, and I no longer can tell what comes from where. So, this is what I was telling in the beginning. What comes from where? Poetry comes from folklore, or folklore comes from poetry, is yet to be decided. Rather, you decide after I have spoken or during I speak. Returning to the native soil, like any other expatriate poet, he initiates a process of rediscovery. He is seen to struggle in his poetry to reintegrate himself with the Indian experience and India. Parthasarathi is very pertinent words. I always quote this. Let me quote and quote. There is something to be said for exile. You learn, roots are deep. These lines speak for a whole generation of Indian English writers, including A K Ramanujan. Though many scholars have regarded the moment of exile as a predicament, the tensions generated in the process have been a fertile soil for the best Indian poetry. Out of this tension came out best Indian poetry. The poems also convey his strong sense of history, the consciousness of the tragedy of India, and of being an Indian, quote unquote, the ancient chaos of a country. He is talking about chaos in the country. It comes through clearly in poems like Compensation, The Last of the Princes, and most of the poems are based on family history, like the Conversations of Despair, Prayers to Lord Murugan. This is one of my favorite poems, Prayers to Lord Murugan. In fact, when I was reading these two poems parallelly, Prayers to Lord Murugan from Relations of A K Ramanujan with Prayers to Lord Jagannath by my supervisor, late Professor Niranjan Mohanty. I was trying to compare the two poems, though I could not find much of comparison, but it was interesting to compare. And Ramanujan, with his tragic vision, is able to evolve the recurring pattern of historical tragedy and individual suffering. The presence of the past in his is a unique feature of his poems. And however, India and America, the two opposites, they exist separately in his poetry. The collection Second Sight is another volume published by the OUP where he gets very serious, nostalgic, philosophical about his Indian past, about time in general. He talks so much about time. I am reminded about T.S. Eliot's time present and time past, how they are always present in the time future. His ideas of time are somehow like that. And in the collection, The Black Hen, he outweighs all other volumes in both quality and quantity. The poems, one of the poems I hear is very interesting. He sounds very mature when he says in the poem Love Poems for a Wife, he regrets, I will quote the poem, quote unquote, really what keeps us apart at the end of years is unshared childhood. So it's a long poem, and then he complains about the unshared childhood with his wife. When he is talking to his cousins about their childhood, the wife is sitting and watching, and probably she is sulking. I can just visualize and imagine things like that. The wife might be sulking that you are talking to your cousins, you are not telling me things. Maybe she did that. Then he says, really, what keeps us apart at the end of years is unshared childhood. We think like that, but we don't say. But the poet, he knows how to put it in the words without, without offending or without hurting the woman. He says like that. And in the Striders, again, recollection works as a mode of redemption for him. I have a book published, I have authored a book, Recollection as a Redemption, where one of the chapters is on A K Ramanujan. And I'm talking about how recollection and memory, they are ways of redemption for him, giving him some sort of mental, emotional peace and harmony, falling back on the past, the memory, and how the chaotic present, the current suffering and pain, everything can be erased by falling back on the past. So one of the lines is about memory. Memory in a crowd of memories seems to have no place at all for unforgettable things. So, such wordplay. Memory and then unforgettable things, and then nothing sounds odd. And sometimes even Ramanujan is very highly critical, witty, satirical, and ironical about some aspects of Hindu heritage when he recollects about his life in India. The title of the poem, The Hindu, Hindoo, the Hindu, he doesn't hurt a fly or a spider either. See that irony of the title. He criticizes himself, being a Hindu, for whom non-violence and weakness are one and the same. Sometimes, he tries to, kind of self do some kind of self pity or criticize himself. Then he writes, quote unquote, "It's time I told you why I'm so gentle. I do not hurt a fly." So for him, being a Hindu or his Hindu past was somehow similar to non-violence and weakness and being so quiet. But in the next stanza, you will see that he is overwhelmed with the cultural heritage of India, the Indian philosophical thinking, the Indian knowledge systems. So, sorry, you can't actually judge the poet. Let me just. The use of private experiences and the poet's sense of continuity with the past continues to be the basis of many of his poems. And he talks about the nourishment from his Indian culture. He talks about his roots, and he talks about, because you cannot, I'm quoting, you cannot entirely live in the present. We are not like that. We are both these things. The past never passes, either the individual past or the historical past or the cultural past. It is with us. This is what gives us the richness of what you call it, the richness of understanding, and the richness of expression. We bring that to whatever is present, and some of this understanding might be simply ironic. So much of it cannot be truly supplied or related to the present. And in the poem Prayers to Lord Murugan, Ramanujan asks for Lord Murugan, the ancient Dravidian god, for deliverance from the obstructions of in a modern world. I'm quoting the poem: "Deliver, O presence, from proxies and absences, from Sanskrit and the mythology of night and the surreal round table mornings of London and return the future to what it was. So this is a part of the collection relations. This much discussed poem, I am quoting what he says, could not have been written if I did not know classical Tamil forms and even some of the images there. I thought of mentioning this, the classical Tamil forms. In Indian folkloristics, classical literatures, modern literatures, and folk literatures, they exchange hands with lot of fluidity, with lot of openness. So when A.K. Ramanujan says that my background of classical Tamil forms makes me a poet, also I read between the lines his understanding of classical Tamil forms also makes him a folklorist. And he admits that Lord Murugan, the six-faced god with 12 hands, the god of fertility, joy, youth, war, beauty, love, these things could take the poet to a remote and an elevated past, which the poet so dearly loves, and then these things make the poet a folklorist. Ramanujan's collected poems appeared posthumously, and then The Black Hen is yet another volume. It was very mature and different. It focuses the poet's reiterating concern for time, body, death, and family. It includes a selection of 62 new poems, out of which, from the 148 poems of the past, he has collected 62 and then added a few more poems. And then here you could find his concern for the family tree, his Indian past, his folk mind has been more intensified in this particular period. And these poems instance a departure from the early poems in the sense that the poet has succeeded in establishing a viable link with the world outside his own self without marginalizing the significance of nature, animal kingdom, and ecology. So these things make him a folklorist. His connection with the green cultural studies, with the blue humanities, ocean humanities, these things slowly take him towards folklore. In course of establishing such a link between folklore and modernism, the poet created a kind of memory culture in his poetry to overcome the stress of the fleeting nature of time and the identity crisis of an expatriate poet, or perhaps the fear of the eternal truth, death. A lot of poems have death consciousness. Anyway, he challenges the biases of the past, though the past has always been his recluse and his utopia. Memory, folklore are the central metaphors. They play a significant role in defining the poet and defining the idea of being rootless. And such kind of a mode also helps A.K. Ramanujan to discover for himself his intrusive willingness to belong to the country of his birth. Though he lived abroad, but through recollection, Ramanujan remains a homebound pilgrim and he remains a folklorist. So his poetry, his connection with the past, his connection with memory, green culture. So these things make him a homebound pilgrim and a folklorist. And then let me just mention briefly how, apart from the poetry collections that we discussed from the pen of A.K. Ramanujan, I will try to tell you 4 to 5 books of A.K. Ramanujan as a folklorist. First one is Folk Tales from India, a selection of oral tales from 22 languages in 1991. And this is a part of our MA program in Folklore and Culture Studies. And this book is widely regarded as A.K. Ramanujan's magnum opus in folklore. And what is so indispensable about this book when I take any class on the collection of folk tales from India by Ramanujan, then a couple of things I always mention. One is it contains 110 folk tales during a period when people did not agree any written literature to be folk literature. There was a school of thought who was very rigid about the orality of folklore. Anything written lost its folkloristic. This is what multiple number of scholars claimed during that rigid period of folklore. When written folklore was not acceptable, A.K. Ramanujan wrote 110 folk tales collected from 22 Indian languages, making it one of the richest comparative folklore collections ever produced in the world. So, I mean, this book is overwhelming And if you go through this book, you will understand what I am telling. Every story is accompanied by Ramanujan's scholarly notes on motifs, performance, regional traditions, bhasha literatures, cultural meanings, and moorings. The introduction towards an anthology of Indian folk tales is another text, is means another part of it. Itself is a landmark essay in folklore theory, the introduction to the book. And the book demonstrates how Indian folklore is multilingual, pluralistic, and constantly changing rather than fixed. Folklore is a running text. This is what A.K. Ramanujan justified. Then the next book by A.K. Ramanujan is A Flowering Tree and Other Oral Tales from India, which was published posthumously in 1997. This collection is more literary than the previous one, it is equally significant. And this collection focuses on storytelling, oral stories, women's narratives. So much of gender and folklore we are talking about. I do lots of research on folklore and gender, so this book is very useful for me and for many of you, I'm sure. He has given women's narratives. When it comes to women and folklore, in the archives and documentation of folklore, 80% of the stories are collected by women and 20% of men. And then this book somehow mentions about women's narrative in folklore. Then the transformation, myths, symbolism, performance traditions, comparative motifs. And the introduction of this book contains some of A.K. Ramanujan's finest reflections on the oral literatures and storytelling. It's very, language is like flowing water if you go through it. Then another book is the collected essays of A.K. Ramanujan. Though it is not exclusively comprehensively only on folklore, this volume has most influential theoretical essays by A.K. Ramanujan, where mirrors are windows, is there an Indian way of thinking, essays on oral traditions, essays on contextuality, folklore and anthropology, translation theory. So imagine, even in this modern world, when the scholars, the professors cannot think of taking these things to the classroom of a folk literature session, A.K. Ramanujan's essays were so much advanced and so much ahead of his time. And for researchers of folklore, this volume is an indispensable, it's Veda, because it presents the conceptual foundations behind his folkloristic work. Then another book is it's not a book, it's an essay, 300 Ramayans, 5 examples, and 3 thoughts on translation. And a lot of controversy is out there about this, but as a scholar, most objectively, I am talking about it and I'm reading about it. Although this is an essay rather than a book, it has become one of the most influential as well as controversial works in comparative folklore and mythology. The essay argues, there are a few things that the essay argues. There is no single Ramayana. Every retelling is culturally situated. Oral and written traditions coexist. Folklore continually represents and recreates epics. And today it is considered essential regarding reading in folklore, comparative literature, translation studies, and cultural studies. And then there is yet another book of A.K. Ramanujan vis-a-vis folk literature and classical literature, mythology, Speaking of Shiva. This is primarily a translation of the Kannada Vachanas, but its introduction is a model of folkloristic and anthropological interpretation, especially for understanding oral devotional traditions and performative cultures. And then coming to ideas like A.K. Ramanujan as a folklorist towards the theories of orality, cultural plurality, and contextual knowledge, there are so many layers of scholarship that if I go on talking about Ramanujan's folk interventions fundamentally, which are epistemological, then I think I will go on speaking for days and days. Ramanujan rejects the notion of folklore as a residual cultural artifact surviving outside history. Instead, folklore is a living cognitive structure through which communities continuously produce, revise, transmit knowledge systems. Oral narratives are not exactly texts, they are performances embedded in specific social ecologies. Their meanings emerge not exactly from relationships among the performers audiences, rituals, rather all of them coexist in a spatial environment, memory, and social hierarchy. Such an understanding resonates remarkably with Delheim's ethnography of speaking, then Richard Bauman's performance theory, Victor Turner's ritual process, while simultaneously remaining deeply rooted in indigenous Indian categories of storytelling and transmission. And then another idea of A.K. Ramanujan as a folklorist, it's the most influential theoretical formulation. It concerns, I will quote, context sensitive versus context free traditions. Is folklore context sensitive or folklore context free? He argues that classical Sanskrit literature increasingly developed into a context free textual tradition capable of circulation beyond local social settings, whereas oral traditions remain profoundly context sensitive, deriving authority from the immediate cultural environment in which they are performed. And this distinction is neither hierarchical nor oppositional, rather, it reveals multiple knowledge systems operating simultaneously in Indian civilization. Then the next emphasis on A.K. Ramanujan's folklore research is long before feminist epistemologists such as Donna Haraway theorized the politics of situated knowledge. A.K. Ramanujan demonstrated that knowledge in oral cultures is inseparable from locally embodied experiences. And another significant idea of A.K. Ramanujan's folkloristic is his concept of intertextuality without textuality. We talk so much about intertextuality and polyphony when it comes to folklore. A.K. Ramanujan had already spoken about it during a period when intertextuality was not even on the tables. Oral traditions constantly absorbed motifs from mythology, epic, local legends, ritual performances, and everyday conversations of us. For example, if you say that, oh, you're so rich, then I may say, or you're so beautiful, I may say, oh, touch wood. No, no, those kind of rituals of daily life which come from folklore, A.K. Ramanujan had collected all of them already. Today, we read books like folk jokes and so many other things, folk tales, and everyone is trying to do something or other on folk literature. But I'm very happy to tell you that since a couple of years, whole country is talking about Indian knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge systems, but I had the courage and conviction and the audacity. I am saying audacity because I was rejected so many times. I had the audacity to design an MA program in folklore and culture studies in the year 2006 and 7 when no one in the English departments was talking about folk literature. And when I proposed a PG diploma in folk literature, I was rejected 4 times. All the boards and all the divisions, everybody rejected me. They said, why folklore? It's so much Nach Gana. Why do you want to do folklore here? But I had to get scientific ideas from A.K. Ramanujan kind of scholars. I took many Western and Indian scholars and their ideas of intertextuality, polyphony, textuality, folkloristic, and then Sanskritization, paradigm, so many things I presented in the university, and ultimately after 4 rejections, the fifth time it was approved, and then I designed an MA program of folk literature with 20,000 pages. And today, when I look at that program, I go back and I read those. Every day, I find new meanings to it. Folklore has created a folk mind in me. Now, what's a folk mind? In the beginning, I said a mind of empathy, a mind of love, somebody who is inclusive, flexible, somebody who is a lover actually. So I'm a lover of this world. I love the universe. I love so many new things, new ideas, music, ethnomusicology, ethnography, so many things coming in front of me. I fall in love with those kinds of things. And A.K. Ramanujan is one of those people who was instrumental in making me fall in love with folk literature. And the oral traditions that he has taught in an intertextual way, they constantly absorb motifs from mythology, epic local legends, ritual performances, and everyday conversations without requiring written textual authority. Every Indian will understand what is orality. In your own families, you might have seen that your mother, your grandmother might be singing some songs which were never written. They were just passed on from generation to generation in a folk way. And A.K. Ramanujan had tried to textualize those, to theorize those, to bring those in a very complex and in a very simple manner to all of us, to make those international. And a folk tale narrated in Karnataka may incorporate elements from the Mahabharata, local goddesses, cults, village histories, colonial memories. See, colonial memories cannot be dismissed. There were so many interesting stories during the colonial memories. I remember I come from a tribal district in Odisha where there is one song, Gundadi Tanjo Preki Paulo. Okay, Fall ko kehte hai Paulo. So in that song, what happens? A village girl is in love with somebody named Paul in the pre-British period. I mean, during the British period, and then during the independence, India gets its independence in 1947, and then Mr. Paul has to go back. So when he goes back, the girl is pregnant, and then her parents, the Kondh tribal parents, they immediately get the girl married off to another person from their own community. Then the girl, when she goes to her in-laws' house, Gona matlab Vidai, that Vidai song, when she's going through the forests, the mountains by walk, and she's pregnant, and Paul is the father, and the person who got married to her is very jealous, though he knows that she is a pregnant woman, but he got married for a big dowry or something like that, and then landed property and stuff like that, and he gets married to her. But on the way, the girl, for every small thing, she utters the name of Paul. Oh Paulo, she says, for Paul. And then this boy is very angry, very annoyed, and then he just pushes her into the river, and the girl dies, and that becomes a myth. That becomes a story of a girl who was deeply in love with a Britisher, and the colonial memories were there. There are so many stories. Look at the body politics here, the body politics, and A.K. Ramanujan has tried to collect those kinds of stories. Even I have collected quite a bit of folk tales and colonial memory stories and everything from various communities, especially from Odisha. Then I have created collections, and many foreign universities are already teaching those books written by me. So I would definitely say that A.K. Ramanujan, kind of a folklorist, has influenced me to create these kind of colonial memory stories from folklore. So every performance is a new textual event rather than a repetition of an original source. When it is folklore, it's no repetition. I'm so much deeply in love with folklore because you know why? Because there's nothing, no repetition. Not a song, not a music, not an idea, not a ritual, not a folk joke, not a folk tale, not a folk theatre, not a folk drama. Anything is not repeated. There is no plagiarism, there is no intertextuality, there is no polyphony. Every voice is distinct because every voice is oral. So that is folklore. And that is what A.K. Ramanujan had understood. And A.K. Ramanujan has influenced people like me and you to read it in that way. So such fluidity destabilizes the Western philosophical and philological obsession with locating authentic originals. Now, what is authentic? In your Indian knowledge systems classrooms, some people might ask you absurd questions. Is it authentic? Well, there is nothing authentic when it comes to these knowledge systems, which are oral, which are passed on from generation to generation, because they are knowledge systems evolving. Folklore evolves every single day. Yesterday, my grandmother told one folk tale to my mother. When my mother tells me that story today, she will definitely add something. When I tell the same folk tale to my son tomorrow, I will add something. And what shall I add? I shall do some kind of value addition. I shall add something knowledge based, something more authentic, more contemporary, and relevant to the present time. Not yesterday's time, but today's time, and then tomorrow's time. So when it is folklore, please don't question about the authentic originals, because folklore is not claiming loud and clear that I am authentic. You read it because it is value addition to your thinking process, to your empathy, to your sympathy, and to your humanity. That is how you have to read. Why? When you read a poem by, say, John Keats or say Percy Bysshe Shelley, the ideas can be sometimes a bit of absurd. Why? You read Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan did the pleasure. So who is Kublai Khan? Of course, there is some mention of Kublai Khan in history, but the ideas. It says that Coleridge he used to take opium of him, and then he wrote that kind of a poem. And we teach and read those poems with conviction in our classroom without asking if is it authentic. Was Kublai Khan actually drinking and smoking and like that? So those beautiful women, did they actually serve those luxuries to Kublai Khan? We don't question those things. Not everything can be questioned because literature is not science. If there is some kind of war going on, literature will not take a gun and shoot the enemy. What will literature do? Literature will create empathy, love, fellow feeling, optimism, positivity in the hearts of human beings through which they can actually stop war. So, literature can influence the human heart and mind. Folklore has similar capacity to influence the human heart and mind. A folk mind is a mind of empathy. A folk mind is a mind of sympathy. And A.K. Ramanujan celebrated that. In his celebrated essay, 300 Ramayans, 5 examples and 3 thoughts on translation, perhaps it's the best example of his folk philosophy where he talks about translations. The national education policy gives so much importance to translations between Indian languages, beyond Indian languages, foreign languages, and then the folk languages and the tribal languages. And this kind of a text had already spoken about those. Rather than treating the Ramayana as a singular canonical text, he conceptualizes it as a vast narrative ecosystem comprising innumerable oral, written, tribal, Jain, Buddhist, Southeast Asian, regional, performative, and folk versions of the Ramayana. My poetry book Sita, a long poem, exactly treats the Ramayana like that. There is no mainstream Ramayana. As a folklorist, even I believe that many Ramayans have influenced the mainstream Ramayans if there is anything called mainstream. Here, folklore is an argument against textual absolutism. And if you look at it from the new historicist's perspective, suppose you are a new historicist and this is a history book and this is a book of literature and you are reading both of them parallelly, then no text can overpower the other. Both the texts will be complementary to each other. They will be supplementary to each other. So A.K. Ramanujan emphasized on that kind of a thing. Every retelling of the Ramayana is simultaneously an interpretation, it's a translation, it's a cultural adaptation, it's a political negotiation. To me, the personal is political. So when I say that, my personal opinion about the Ramayana is naturally my political opinion about the Ramayana, which says that Ramayana is one of the most empathetic green cultural texts that the world has ever seen. And A.K. Ramanujan probably believed in this kind of folkloristic quality of the Ramayana. The very existence of multiple Ramayans dismantles notions of singular origins, stable authenticity, and centralized authority. His argument parallels Derrida's critique of logocentrism by exposing the impossibility of an uncontaminated origin of any text for that matter. So, the Derridan ideas. Ramanujan's folkloristics also engage profoundly with structural anthropology, particularly the legacy of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and he departs significantly from the structuralist universalism. While Lévi-Strauss he seeks universal binary structures underlying myths, Ramanujan privileges cultural particularity, regional specificity, and historical contingency in any text. He recognizes recurring ideas and narrative structures, but he refuses to reduce folklore to abstract cognitive models detached from lived communities. Structures exist, but they remain historically negotiated and socially inhabited. This is what the poet in A.K. Ramanujan makes him do. Another central contribution to the concerns of folklore by A.K. Ramanujan is translation as ethnography. His translations are accompanied by elaborate introductions and annotations because folklore cannot be understood independently of its cultural ecology. Translation performs anthropology rather than mere philosophy or philology. And then, another contribution on the engagement of A.K. Ramanujan with folklore is his women's folklore or folklore and gender. It deserves good attention by you and me by documenting women's songs like, bidai songs, sadi wala songs, lot of songs he documents, domestic narratives, ritual performances. He reveals how oral traditions are alternative archives of gendered experiences. In one of the folk tales, he writes about in the Bidai song, while the girl is going to her in law's house, in a sing song voice, she is singing before her parents that, जब मैं पैदा हुई मेरा गला क्यों नहीं दबा के मार दिया, kind of things. मुझे ससुराल जाना पड़ रहा है. And that song is so beautifully written, and Ramanujan has collected those kind of songs, and then in a nuanced manner, a lot of gender discourses, how a boy has a privileged position that after marriage he will not go anywhere. The girl will leave her house from hundreds of kilometers and come to stay on in another person's house. Then, the corruption of a society, so many things, and then childbirth, then the songs thereof. He connects those oral traditions and he creates alternative archives of gendered experiences. And these expressive forms frequently articulate desires, frustrations, emotional labor, marital negotiations, reproductive anxieties, and resistance in many cases, which are absent from official literary canons. When it is folklore, one can be fluid, one can be free, there can be free flow of thoughts. Women's oral narratives expose what Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak later conceptualizes as the politics of the subaltern speech. So it was already there in folklore. And then Ramanujan's work simultaneously and similarly anticipates contemporary subaltern historiography. And unlike the colonial documentation, his kind of folklore remembers history effectively rather than chronologically. There is no chronology to the history that he presents. Memory is experiential rather than documentary. Perhaps Ramanujan's most original methodological innovation in folklore is his notion of telling rather than the tale. Telling, that means orality, rather than the tale itself. His folklore possesses no definitive existence outside its performance, and the performative orientation of Ramanujan also transforms our understanding of authorship. Like Rola Barthes' declaration of the death of the author, Ramanujan has already hinted at that. His performative orientation transforms our understanding of authorship by oral narratives that possess distributed scholarship rather than individual authorship. No one is the author here. It's distributed generation to generation, adding new ideas every day. Communities collectively produce, modify, remember, and authenticate the narratives across the generations. Even Ramanujan went on to say in one of his interviews that I think an oral text is more powerful than the written text, because if this is a written text, then Nandini has written it. I mean, he didn't say my name, I'm just giving an example. If it is a written text, then I have written it. So this is my idea. But if it is an oral text, it's a folk text, then everyone has contributed. So it has the room for improvement. It has the room for being contemporary. So he privileges the oral text above and over the written text. So for him, comparison is neither evolutionary nor universal abstraction, rather, it is relational interpretation. His famous distinction between the interior landscapes and exterior landscapes in his poetry, it developed through classical Tamil poetics. So when I was doing my research on him in 98, 99, and 2000, that period, I read a lot about interior landscapes and exterior landscapes, and I was thinking, what is this? Though I had memorized quite a bit, but after reading Ramanujan as a folklorist, I could actually understand the concept of interior landscapes and exterior landscapes. It developed through classical Tamil poetics. Also, it informs his folkloristic readings, human emotions, ecological environments, ritual spaces, narrative structures, and they remain interconnected rather than compartmentalized. All his ideas, they are interconnected, they're never compartmentalized. Folklore embodies ecological consciousness long before environmental humanities emerged as an academic discipline. Now, there are departments of environmental humanities, and Ramanujan had already spoken about that. Rivers, forests, animals, seasons, agricultural cycles, they function as settings, also as active participants in the cultural myth making, meaning making. And from a post colonial perspective, Ramanujan resists both colonial ethnography and cultural nationalism. And then contemporary folklore studies, they acknowledge concepts such as intangible cultural heritage, cultural memory, embodied knowledge systems, vernacular modernity, which I call bhasha modernity, multi-vocabulary and performative identity. Remarkably, Ramanujan anticipated many of these theoretical debates decades earlier when no one was even thinking about them. He had conceptualized. And his scholarship reveals folklore as an archive of living knowledge traditions. This is not just nostalgic preservation. Tradition survives because it changes. So, tradition that is evolving. In the 21st century, A.K. Ramanujan's ideas acquired renewed relevance in digital folklore studies, internet meme or something, meme you call, no? Yes. Then digital storytelling, online rituals, virtual communities, artificial intelligence, social media narratives. They continue to demonstrate the contextual adaptability that Ramanujan identified in the oral traditions decades earlier when no one thought about it. The mediums have changed, but the fundamental processes of collective narration, variation, circulations, and meaning making, they are strikingly similar what we are reading in our university tables today and what A.K. Ramanujan had predicted decades and decades earlier when no one even understood those ideas. I will conclude by saying A.K. Ramanujan redefined folklore as an interdisciplinary intellectual enterprise situated in the intersections of linguistics, anthropology, literary criticism, translation, transliteration, transcreation, philosophy, cultural studies, and history and literature and linguistics. His works teach us that folklore is neither the voice of the past nor the culture of the folk. Rather, folklore is an ongoing epistemic practice through which societies reimagine themselves, they negotiate power, they preserve memory, they continuously reinvent traditions. His enduring legacy is there in demonstrating that every folk tale is simultaneously a linguistic act. A story is an act, actually, it's not just a text. It's a cultural performance, a historical archive, a philosophical critical inquiry, and an ethical encounter with plurality, not with singularity, but plurality. In this sense, A.K. Ramanujan, my favorite, is one of the most theoretically sophisticated poet folklorists of modern India. His scholarship continues to shape global debates on orality, narrative structures, poetry, translation, and the politics of cultural knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, madam, for your illuminating and intellectually engaging, enriching lecture. Now, I respectfully invite our chairperson, Professor Vashvaraj P. Donal, sir, to deliver the presidential remarks.
Good evening. Submoy, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Thank you. Dear viewers of Dharwad Katte, we have listened to Professor Nandini Sahu, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Hindi University, West Bengal. Professor Nandini Sahu spoke on A.K. Ramanujan, the poet and folklorist. She spoke for about 15 minutes. It's a wonderful talk on a wonderful poet and a wonderful folklorist. I particularly liked Madam's presentation today, and I also like her commitment. And she's one of our finest poets, and she's also one of our very bright academics. Despite her busy schedule, she could accept our invitation and deliver a very wonderful talk today on A.K. Ramanujan. Professor Nandini Sahu's talk on A.K. Ramanujan was profound, comprehensive, and highly thought-provoking. It offered deep insights into his life, works, and contributions, making for an intellectually stimulating and engaging presentation. And we all know that K Ramanujan was a wonderful poet and a folklorist, and we read him in Kannada, in Tamil, in English, and several other languages. K Ramanujan exerted a tremendous influence on modern Indian playwrights. He narrated the same folk tale to both Chandrasekhar Kambar and Girish Karnad. Drawing on this tale, Kambar wrote Sirisampike and Karnad wrote Nagamandala. Both plays went on to become landmark works in modern Indian drama, and both playwrights were later honored with the Jnanpith Award. Ironically, A.K. Ramanujan, whose narrative inspired these celebrated works, received no such recognition. Ramanujan's poetry, I will add just few observations to what Madam has said. She has already delivered a very wonderful, very comprehensive, very detailed talk on A.K. Ramanujan as a poet and folklorist. And I will add some 3 to 4 observations to what she has said. A.K. Ramanujan's poetry combines simplicity, emotional depth, and intellectual subtlety. I particularly admire his poetry for his intellectualism. His works illuminates Indian myths, folklores, customs, and everyday life. Ramanujan's translations of classical Tamil and Kannada poetry, including Vachanas, introduced Indian literary traditions to global audience without losing their poetic beauty. This is something special about A.K. Ramanujan. I admire his translation of Vachanas, speaking of Shiva. So far he is the best translator available. Who has translated Vachanas of all major Vachanakaras into English. A.K. Ramanujan was one of the finest poets of modern India, one of the finest poets that modern India produced, and he is one of our greatest translators as well. Had he not translated Sauskara into English, Anantamurthy would have remained unknown to the English-speaking world. So he should thank A.K. Ramanujan for translating his novel into English. His exceptional command of language, deep engagement with Indian literary traditions, and remarkable sensitivity to cultural nuances made him one of the most influential literary figures of modern India. But I don't accept his views on the Ramayana. I very carefully listened to Madam's responses to A.K. Ramanujan with regard to his with regard to his views on the Ramayana and 200 Ramayanas, 300 Ramayanas, and so on. So his interpretation of the Ramayana is not universally accepted. Many scholars, many well-known scholars have also objected to his interpretation of the Ramayana. I don't want to elaborate this. However, I would place on record that I disagree with his approach and conclusions with regard to the Ramayana. But I like him as a poet. I have always enjoyed reading his poetry, and I admire him for his extremely beautiful translation of the Vachanas of Basvanna, Akkamadevi, Allama Prabhu, Devarada Simaya, and so on. And I have always admired Sanskara, his translation of Sanskara, than the original novel. So, we have many reasons to admire A.K. Ramanujan both as a poet and as a folklorist. Madam Nandini Sahu has made a fine job of it. And she has not only introduced A.K. Ramanujan to the viewers of the Katte, she has also drawn our attention to certain important qualities that we can trace in A.K. Ramanujan's poetry and his writings on Indian folklore. With these scattered remarks of mine, I call it a day, and I request the viewers of the Katte to interact with Professor Nandini Sahu. And you should know that Nandini Sahu madam is currently working as the Vice Chancellor of Hindi University in Bengal. And when I called her and requested her to accept the invitation and come to Dabarkatte and give a presentation, she has agreed. I must thank Nirmal and Submoy because they are the ones who contacted madam on our behalf and took her date and arranged this wonderful program. Madam, thank you so much, and I request you again come back to Dabarkatte.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, so may I log out? Nirmal, Dr. Nirmal?
Madam,
Madam, please wait for
you can take a couple of questions, madam, if there are any.
Questions. Okay, please take 2 to 3 minutes. I have to join something else as well. Yeah.
Yes. Just one question, then we'll conclude.
So no, take 2, 3. Yes.
Okay, now the floor is open for question answers. If you have any queries, you can ask, madam, or any reflections as such, you can ask.
Only 1 or 2 questions. Submoy. Yes. Approve.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
My name is Apurva Navle, and I was your student because I did my bachelor's from Indira Gandhi University in BA Honors. And I have a question. In your presentation, you've mentioned that A.K. Ramanujan's folklores destabilizes the originality, the authenticity. So, if as a researcher or of English literature, like what implications, what I have to look for, if I cannot like look for the originality, the authorship of the text, if he does not if he does not put so much emphasis on it.
Okay, better, Apurva, thank you. Congratulations. You studied from IGNO, the best in the world's best. Okay. So, when I said destabilizes, I did not mean that he dismisses any particular text. He destabilizes the power of one text over other.
Okay.
So that is what I intended to say, that if there is one particular theme, very important theme, which is classical, which is from mythology, and then there are 2 important texts, then he will not say that this text is more powerful and authentic, the other one is not authentic. Rather, he gives us an alternative research platform through which we can understand the best positions of both the texts. That is what I intended. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I have one observation, madam. In Indian context, you have already mentioned it, though. We have always prioritizes the written over the oral.
Yes.
Even in Western context, Derrida has this destabilizes this kind of hierarchy of privileging this written tradition over oral tradition, or something that is written or writing or speech to be specific, logocentrism and phonocentrism to be specific. Even in Ramanujan, we have this kind of thing. That is what you have addressed, and it's very insightful.
Thank you so much. We are going through, Dr. Nirmal, you are a scholar, you will know it. We are going through a very beautiful time of our country now, where the national education policy is giving us so much flexibility about our courses and our syllabi. They are not asking us to dismiss any existing course that we have in our departments. They are giving us more flexibility, more entry and exit options, and add more number of electives on Indian knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems, Hindu studies, and so many important themes and so many variations that they are giving us. So here you are. You pointed out something very important. Thank you for that.
Yes. And sorry, ma'am, I am Submaikar, not able to say.
Okay.
Good evening, ma'am.
This should be the last question because madam
It's
has
not
to
a
attend.
question. It's not a question, only my reflection, that is all. I'm Dr. Geeta Madhusudan from Jain University, Department of Languages, Sanskrit area. It was a very wonderful session, ma'am. I thoroughly enjoyed because in a very short span of time, about 50 minutes, beautiful insights about AK Ramanujan was given, and I really appreciate the talk that was given by you, ma'am. It was excellent. And about the folklore, because I even deal with Indian aesthetics also, and the this one topics, I mean the points that you were touching upon was really great, because I can even make use of it in the classes, I felt. Thank you so much for your inspiring session. And Baswaraj sir, thank you also for your presidential address, sir. It was a pleasure to have attended this particular program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
मैडम मैं हिंदी में बात कर सकता हूँ मैडम?
आप हिंदी में
हाँ
बात
प्लीज
करिए।
करिए, मुझे बहुत अच्छा हिंदी आता है, बोलिए बोलिए हिंदी
अच्छी
में
बात
भी
है
कुछ
मैडम। आप
बोलिए।
तो रामायण के बारे में बोले, अब रामायण के में ओरिजिनलिटी ऑथेंटिसिटी ढूंढना ही गलत है मैडम, क्योंकि वो 4-5 हजार साल के पहले हुई घटना, वो हजारों साल बाद 2-3 हजार साल के बाद में लिखावट में आई, वहां तक एक से एक बोलते आए, कहते आए। आपने बोला ना वैसे, जो मैं सुना, मैं जरा मिलाया, मेरे पूर्वज जरा मिलाया, ऐसे आया हो। मैं क्या कहता हूँ, ओरिजिनलिटी ऑथेंटिसिटी ढूंढना गलत है। वो जो रामायण पढ़ते हैं वही रामायण,
वही रामायण
दूसरों
है
को
सर, आपने
कंपेयर मत करना।
बिल्कुल सही बोला। ये जो ऑथेंटिसिटी के चक्कर में ना पड़े, झगड़ा ना करे,
यस,
सामने जो
जो
रामायण
रामायण
है
पढ़ते
वही
हैं वही
अच्छा है
रामायण है,
तो।
दूसरा रामायण से कंपेयर नहीं करने का।
हाँ जी सर, बिल्कुल आपने बिल्कुल सही बोला, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया।
थैंक यू मैडम।
Okay, as we come to the end of this wonderful session, and it is my pleasant duty to propose the vote of thanks. First and foremost, I express my sincere gratitude to our esteemed resource person, Professor Nandini Sahu Madam, for delivering such an insightful and enriching lecture. Your presence and scholarly reflections have truly added great value to this series. And I also extend my heartfelt thanks to our respected chairperson, Professor Vaswaraj Donor sir, for his inspiring leadership, constant encouragement, and valuable presidential remarks. And I also thank all the participants and viewers who joined us today and made this session successful through their active presence and participation. With this, we conclude today's session. Thank you all once again. Have a wonderful evening ahead. Thank you.
थैंक यू, सभी को
मैडम, thank
नमस्कार।
you.
थैंक यू प्रोफेसर वासुराज।